Extremely key, important foreign policy decisions are being made in the geopolitical sphere. And in this video, we're going to give you a breakdown of the latest, most important news without any mainstream corporate or government spin. Now, as we're speaking right now, the Russians have just confirmed that a bomb did bring down their civilian airliner in Egypt. The bomb was placed there by ISIS and was an improvised home device with 2.2 pounds of explosives on that airplane that took it down. Putin is saying that retribution is inevitable against ISIS. It will be interesting to see his foreign policy decisions in the next coming days. But as we know, this ISIS terrorist attack killed 224 innocent civilians, more than the attacks in Paris, France. In response to the attacks in Paris, France, the French government has started to bomb Raqqa in Syria, the headquarters of ISIS. If you look at all the major media reports, especially in the United States, it's the same talking point about how these attacks were massive airstrikes. But when you look at the foreign coverage, you could actually see that it was only 20 bombs. Compare that to what Russia has been doing against ISIS, destroying 448 targets in just 3 days. These French airstrikes are insignificant. There's also a lot of talk about invoking Article 5 of the NATO protocol that would invoke a full all-out scale war against ISIS. But with this talk being heavy at the beginning of the Paris attacks, this talk is dying down and it is no longer becoming a significant issue, and it looks like that will not happen in any way, shape, or form. There was an extremely important talk between two superpowers of Russia and the United States, Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin, at the G20 just a few days ago. Now, the exact details of what was talked about in this extremely important conversation are not yet revealed, but we know general topics like Ukraine and Syria were discussed. I find it extremely interesting that Barack Obama finally sat down with Putin right before Putin's speech at the G20, where he listed and gave evidence to 40 countries, including the countries at the G20, where he was speaking at the G20, that have financially supported ISIS. Putin, in his talk, as the Russian insider puts, took the gloves off, and he primarily talked about the illegal oil trade that ISIS has within its country, that has Saudi Arabia and Turkey purchasing oil from ISIS, financing their operations, yet there are no international sanctions put on them when they are directly financing ISIS terrorists. Putin talked about 40 countries, many of them which were at the G20. He, of course, situated this with the topic of the Paris tragedy and said that we need to understand that the means of financing terrorism should be severed. Obviously, this is an extremely important issue, because if ISIS is not being supported or will stop being supported by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, and the United States, they will not be able to continue their operation. I know it's a very grave claim, but let me tell you why this important conversation has huge repercussions, especially after Putin's speech at the G20. Now, as we know, WikiLeaks documents have just come out showing how the Syrian government and Bashar al-Assad offered the United States a partnership to stop ISIS in February of 2010. The United States declined that offer by the Syrians. The Russians and Putin urged the United States and asked them to fight alongside of them against ISIS in October of this year. Putin invited the State Department, the U.S. military, to come to Moscow and to work out and negotiate a deal where they could fight ISIS together. The United States declined that offer. When Iraq was seeing the effective measures that Russia was having against ISIS, they asked them for help. Then the United States sent the Joint Chiefs of Staffs to meet with the president of Iraq, and he told them, if you ally, if you work with Russia against ISIS, you're our enemy. Iraq at the time said, no, we're going to be with the United States. And then days later said the United States is not effective against ISIS in any way, shape, or form, and that they will actually ally with Russia, and they have done so, along with Jordan sharing an intelligence pact with Syria and Iran, and Russia now, with all these countries, to destroy ISIS together. There's also other important news reports that are not being highlighted. As we know, there's a UN document that's revealing how Israel was actually helping the Syrian rebels who were fighting against Assad. These Syrian rebels are, of course, al-Nusra and ISIS, the two major components. The Jerusalem Post even reported how these documents, these new UN documents, show how the Israelis have been doing more than simply treating wounded Syrian civilians in hospitals. This and a few past reports have described transfers of unspecified supplies from Israel to the Syrian rebels, ISIS, al-Nusra, and sightings of IDF soldiers meeting with the Syrian opposition east of the Green Zone, as well as incidents when Israeli soldiers opened up the fence to allow Syrians through who did not appear to be injured. As the UNDOF report concludes, these people, these rebels, included members of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. If this wasn't evidence enough, Michael T. Flynn, the former head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, in this breaking interview that you can see in the description below, talked about how the United States directly supported and financed al-Nusra and ISIS in the region inside of Syria, and how he protested that and was still told to continue that operation.